mainly I want to break this down for myself because over the years I've watched my consciousness and my awareness of the topic of astrology shift dramatically from, let's go back to when I was in college, not even thinking about astrology, not even on my mind. If someone was like, yo, I think there's something to astrology, I would have said probably because of gravitational influences, of the influences of light or other elementary particles flying through space. But I would have never got a reading. I would have been like, that's silly. Of course they're going to tell you something because of X, Y, and Z. Of course it's going to connect somehow because they're just saying broad general things, and I would have had all these reasons to criticize it. And I then move onwards in life, and I personally have a health experience, a traumatic brain injury that pushes me to the fringes of medicine and off the edge of the cliff. And my time in life had been spent being interested in the esoteric, being aware of the corruption and the shadows that are hiding in the world, but standing at the doorways of initiation, I would say. Until one day, I hear a conversation between Robert Edward Grant and Aubrey Marcus. Now, Robert Edward Grant is a man who he's spoken at the World Economic Forum. He's spoken with the Dalai Lama at length. He has, I'm pretty sure he's gone to the Vatican, spoke at the Vatican. I'm not sure. I know his companion, Matthias Di Stefano, has done a ceremony at the Vatican. The reason I'm mentioning this is because he is, in a sense, a bridge between the worlds of science and the world of magic, spirituality, our soul, the magic of numbers, and he's a modern-day polymath. He's like a modern-day Leonardo da Vinci. And it took his logical reasoning about numbers, about quantum physics, about the ancient traditions that quantum physics in a lot of ways validates. It took this moment. I was mowing the lawn and my head was cranked up to 11 and terrible pain, but I'm listening to a podcast mowing the lawn, and this conversation, like a wormhole, opened me up to the grand possibility. And maybe it's not even grand, but the possibility that astrology, numerology, magic, all of this stuff was way more real than even any of the life that I thought was real up until that point. So, as a human being, you come into this world as of essentially kind of like you're in this theta brainwave state where you're just open to receiving. And that is a highly programmable state. So from the time that you're born, and if you go through the United States public education or even private education system, in many ways you're being indoctrinated with what the powers that be say that you're supposed to learn. And that's a whole nother tangent to go down related to what happened with World War I and what happened with World War II and the eradication of free thinking and natural thinking, and that's a whole different conversation to go down. But when you go through this system and your whole life you're being programmed to essentially be insane and psychotic when it comes to the natural abundance and the natural flow of the world. And then if you want to step out and say, hey, sound heals me, or hey, any of these alternative therapies that people have deemed as woo-woo or conspiracies or whatever it is, or miraculous healing, you get just immediately written off by the collective frequency band, the collective group think that has been taught a certain way. And there's no judgment there. That is totally fine, and it's just natural forces at play. But it is something that when someone like myself wakes up, and mainly through a severe traumatic brain injury, which was layered on top of type 1 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes already, because of insulin and anxiety that I was predisposed to, always had me thinking about, well, what happens if the world falls apart? You know, like, what happens if there's a war that breaks out? What do you do for insulin? And again, like when COVID hit, you go, what do you do for insulin? And what if they're trying to tell me that I have to get a smart chip in me so that I can go get my insulin? Like, all these questions start coming out. So then you start going down to the roots of how did we even end up in this society at all? So, with that said, I ended up on this podcast where they're talking about numerology and astrology, and my mind was absolutely just totally expanded. And from that day forward, I started slowly, but then really ramped up in 2024, or in 2023 into 2024, where I was doing my own self-study of the astrological signs as they clicked through the year, and I was listening to Molly McCord's podcast about astrology, and the level of synchronicities and the level of that is so directly what is happening with me right now. I can't believe this. It happened repeatedly. I mean, it's happening to this day, to the point where I'm looking at astrology as just basically it's like pure science. And the reason that I've come to understand, at least from my own perspective, of why people, it's a catch-22, right? Because astrology is talking about archetypes, and it's talking about, or like the gene keys in human design. It's talking about archetypes and like you could say, different personalities or different ways of expression in the world. So, if someone is to give you an astrology reading, or say anything about astrology to you in some way, shape, or form, no matter what they say, if you are able to receive and stand in deep enough contemplation, you will discover how that piece of information relates to you. So in some sense, I think you could kind of like give people random charts and random readings, and this is what charlatans that work with this do, and maybe they slip into more of like a black magic sense where maybe they're just trying to make money, or maybe they're trying to make a name for themselves, or maybe this, and maybe the people walk out of those appointments and they actually do receive a divine piece of wisdom. But for me, I never wanted to just like randomly ramble stuff out. I have a very logic-oriented mind, so I had to track this over time and track this over a number of years. Now we're in 2025, so I've been doing it for like 2, 3, 4, 5 years now, and coming from the place where I thought, yeah, there's got to be something to it, but why waste all your time with the stars, right? What you come to realize is that the ancients, they saw the stars all the time, and they were able to utilize the stars and utilize their relationship with the stars in order to live life and live in abundance. The grand arc of time, in my opinion, this is another interesting thing that I've thought about, where it seemed as if at one point in human history that humans had reached an equilibrium with the tribes that were living on planet Earth. Now, this is just like a theoretical thought experiment. I don't want any facts thrown at me about this or discussed. This is like a pure thought experiment. But I get the sense that there was a time when there was an equilibrium where internally in tribes, the tribe had reached a acidic state where it was operating at its highest possible essence within the environment that was given to it. Now, the human species wanted to go through an upgrade process, and so those tribes and those connections started clashing up against each other, and by clashing up against each other, then you start evolving. You go, one divides into the two of duality, and then two has to do the hard work and the karmic clearing and the shadow work in order to reunite again back into the Trinity, or you go back to the one by going to the three, essentially. And that's the Trinity that we see in Christianity. That's the 369, Nikola Tesla talking about the powers of these numbers. Like, this is where this comes from. It's numbers initially had qualities, and you see that with how they're represented in the like in Hebrew, and if you're reading, I don't know what the word is for this, but like the legitimate Hebrew, where like the gematria, where the numbers mean something and they also have a sound to them. So these numbers used to have qualities, and then we pigeonholed the numbers and crunched them in and compressed them, and so that they only had quantities, and then we only used them for logic and math. Now we're coming back to a unified quality and quantity, and it moves upwards, not back to one, not back to quality, but back to a synthesis of the two into the three. So through this process of me realizing about astrology, I started connecting with numbers, and I just looked at a 3 right when I said that. That's fun. I started, see, it's like, this is what I mean. You start, what inevitably happens once you stand at the doorways of initiation, and is you start having so many synchronicities that it would be mathematically implausible for this many things numerically to happen around you. Like, it just literally, the odds would be so astronomical. And some would say, well, Dad, isn't that just how we like design our system with numbers, and these numbers just show up more? And it's like, no. The level of like the timing of synchronicities is just, it becomes to the point where it's just your new normal. And you recognize that magic is just mundane. And there's literally no difference in someone saying, hey, I'm going to study and work really hard so that I can affect my life and move forward in life. That is the same thing as magic. I'm not talking about conjuring spirits or like doing anything crazy. I'm talking about hard work on the daily that actually just becomes mundane. And a lot of times, magic is no different than the lifestyles that we've all been taught how to live. It's just that in the modern era, there is a need for things to happen at a more rapid pace. And so our skill sets as a human being and our divine design inside of our matrix, inside of us, inside our genes, that light is asking to be expressed. And one of the reasons why I like the gene keys so much is, one, they're built on top of the I Ching, which I find to be a fascinating divination tool inside of itself. And the I Ching, so this segment of the story, I think, is really important for people who are logic-oriented brains to hear. So the I Ching was invented in ancient historic China by a dude who's sitting on the side of the river or the creek, and he essentially asked God, why is this happening? Like, what's going on down here? And he looks down at the back of the turtle, and the lines on the back of the turtle form these patterns. And that original moment of divine wisdom was translated into the 8 trigrams. So that's 3 lines on top of each other. The line can either be solid or it can be broken. And so that by doing all the permutations of that, you get 8 of them. These 8 trigrams are then stacked on top of each other, so 8 times 8 equals 64. The I Ching has been shown to be mathematically similar, if not the same, in its operating system as our 64 codons that operate inside of us human beings. It's a 64-bit matrix in some sense, and if you know computers, you'll know that there's an overlap here. So if you start seeing what's going on with AI, right, you start going, and computers, you say, hey, maybe we're not so different from, maybe there's a core operating system here going on. Maybe consciousness sits at the bedrock, and numbers are not just quantities that we throw around, but they really have a divine quality to them. And that's what the I Ching, before anyone knew anything about the DNA or really knew anything about computers or 64-bit coding or anything like this divination tool that then has been used for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so you also have to ask yourself the question, well, evolution doesn't just bring things along that if you believe in, the traditional view of evolution here as it operates in local environments, because even Darwin's experiments were like super localized, and it's a question of how evolution really happens. But if you believe in, as I believe in evolution to an extent as well. So if you believe in that, it's like evolution isn't going to bring things along that make no sense. And so evolution brought along this thing called the I Ching. So if you think of that at like the beginning in like, say, the Garden of Eden, there's this moment in time where there's like a boom, and then that's pure peace and love, and then it separates. Well, that separation, and say the I Ching was at that moment back then when it was like pure peace and love, divine oracles coming out of the sky and telling you stuff on turtles, right? Imagine you're at that moment, and now the universe says, God says, okay, we're going to make it go into duality so that you all can learn how to get back here. And so in the 19th century, there were people who looked at the I Ching and said, yo, this is very similar to like what we're doing with math and what we're doing with computers. And then there's a guy named Ra who has this profound awakening experience and ends up basically so much energy entered his body, so much wisdom, that he didn't know what to do with it. And he ends up living in a tree in somewhere in Europe, I believe. I should figure out exactly where it is. But this guy is writing all these pieces of paper down like he's a crazed madman. And one day somebody walks by and is like, yo, this is genetic coding that I'm looking at here. And so he ends up being able to get him out of the tree. And by getting him out of the tree, he talks to him, and they figure some shit out, or he figures some shit out, Ra does, and comes up with this design called human design, which is literally a tool for you to understand your design. And it's born off of the I Ching in a combination with astrology. So you can overlap the I Ching onto astrology. So this is a story of thousands of years of science in the modern era coming to validate what the spiritual masters of old have talked to us about. And from Eastern and Western traditions is one of the outgrowths of I Ching and then human design, and it is called the Gene Keys. The Gene Keys, if you read the book, speaks at length about Jesus and the apostles and how the sacrificial story of Jesus is one that brings awareness to the consciousness on planet Earth, amongst many other different things that this archetypal story tells us. And so, as one lives in the modern era, as I'm living right now, and I know what I've learned from quantum physics, and I know what I know from the spiritual traditions, and I start seeing, hey, these things are kind of saying the exact same thing with just a little bit different language. Like, the spiritual traditions say we live in the Maya, we live in an illusion. Like, the Bible says the devil is the king of this earth, and yours is the next one, basically. And so it makes me wonder, right, when you learn all of this information, that it puts the thought in your head that, hey, these ancient people were doing science, they just didn't know how to call it science yet. And then people started doing science, and they didn't know what they were really searching for was God again. And now there's people out there that are trying to become God with the science. So this is my tale through astrology, and it's been a really interesting one because now it's a tool. And who is it that says billionaires use astrology and millionaires don't? There you go. Start tapping into the astrology. Let's all awake together.